Good evening. Thank you for joining us tonight for the USF Lecture Series at the Allen County Public Library. Tonight we are joined by Dr. Michelle Palmer, the Program Director for the Masters of Health Administration Program. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Palmer.
Thank you very much. So I would like to thank Allen County Public Library and its patrons for inviting me here tonight, and I would also like to thank Anna Calamine, as well as the Access Fort Wayne and the Events Department here at the Allen County Public Library. I really appreciate this opportunity. So my topic tonight is building trust in controversial times. And the importance of trust. It's really crucial. Research shows that trust is important in building good, effective working relationships. It's also important in terms of knowledge sharing. So if you ever think of a situation that you might have had where you were working with somebody and they didn't trust you, so they weren't willing to share information with you, and that hindered you from doing your job effectively. So trust is important in making sure that knowledge is shared, and then trust is also important in terms of outcomes. So one example is turnover. There's less turnover when employees report that they're trusting of their managers. Actually, a study was done looking at profitability of fast food, fast food stores of a particular fast food chain, and when employees trusted their manager, there was actually higher profits at those particular stores. So there was a magnet that I saw a few years ago, and it said, "Raisin cookies that look like chocolate chip cookies are the reason why I have trust issues." And so what I want to say is that I want to do a little bit of a disclaimer. I'm going to talk about trust tonight, but I'm not a theologian. I also know that we have the banking crisis going on, and I'm not a finance professor. So don't be expecting chocolate chip cookies, expect raisin cookies. I can't answer questions about those types of things. What I'm going to do tonight is talk to you about trust from the perspective of a theory of trust that started out in the business research, the business world, so to speak, but it actually has been used in healthcare, in marketing, in computer science, all different types of fields. So, trust. One of the things that we want to think about is, who do we trust, right? We make decisions about trusting every day, but who do we trust? And then, in what situations do we trust? When, where, and why? So trust is not all-encompassing. We don't approach trust and say, oh, I'm going to trust this person 100% of the time with every single thing in my life. We make decisions about, I'm going to trust my accountant to do my taxes, but I'll trust somebody else. I'll trust this person to repair my car. Don't necessarily trust my accountant to repair my car. So we make these decisions about trust. And so what I'm going to talk about tonight is I'm going to talk about risk. I'm going to talk about a definition of trust. I'm going to talk about what leads to trust. They're called trustworthiness factors. And then I'm going to talk about how to build trust. So first, in talking about risk, when we have this potential to suffer a loss in some way, and that loss could be financial, it could be physical, or it could be non-physical. So it could be just in different ways. When we're at risk, we are vulnerable, we're susceptible to harm. And so one of the things we want to think about is that the harm could be non-physical. So raillery, that teasing, right? That it could be nice teasing, but then it could also be not so nice teasing. Criticism, we could be harmed by criticism. We could also be harmed by calumny. In other words, somebody who is falsely misrepresenting us, our reputation, right? So we can suffer in different ways, either through we're vulnerable, we're open to being hurt by our reputation, or through criticism, or through somebody just kind of, teasing us a little bit. So when we think about risk, it's not just the act of engaging in an act with somebody else, right? I'm going to go to the store. I'm going to go to a restaurant. I'm going to have a meal. So I'm taking a risk because I'm trusting that they're going to prepare that meal properly. But it's also the consequences of the act. And so when we think about risk, we're not just thinking about what are we doing, but we're also thinking about what might happen as a result of doing this thing, whatever that is. As I mentioned, going to a restaurant. what's important here is the period after has a strong effect on the decision before, right? When we're thinking about whether or not we're going to trust somebody, we're weighing a lot of different things in our mind. When we also think about risk, we tend to think about distribution. In other words, less for me, right? The red here, less for me means more for somebody else, right? I want to, that risk that I am anticipating, many times we tend to think about it as, well, I want to get rid of some of this risk or move the risk and put it somewhere else, right? So I am less vulnerable. But what I'm proposing tonight is that we think about minimizing risk, not so much in terms of distribution, but in terms of building trust, so that when we're encountering risk with another party, with somebody else or an institution, we're looking at building trust and having a lot of trust so that that risk is minimized for both of us. So the theory that I'm going to use tonight is by Dr. Mayer, Dr. Davis, and Dr. Scoorman, and they came up with this model of trust. And when they talk about trust, the first thing that we need to do is just talk about some terms. So we have a trustor and a trustee, and this is always where it gets a little confusing. So the trustee, when we think of a bank, we have trustees at a bank. We're trusting them with our money. So that's defined as the party being trusted, whereas the trustor is the person who's actually doing the trusting. And we can think about trust in terms of people, interpersonal trust, or we can think about trust in terms of institutional trust. So people do trust institutions. It could be a hospital, it could be a school, or it could be a business. So we think about trust in terms of institutions or between people. So the definition of trust that Mayer, Davis, and Scoorman came up with is the willingness of a trustor. So I'm just going to go back here for a second. So it's the willingness of the trustor, and I have this arrow on purpose. This is, somebody said to me earlier, well, they only have one eye, and I was like, well, I did that on purpose. That's supposed to be a profile, because there's supposed to be side. Okay, there's a reason why I don't teach art. So they're in profile, and the trustor is looking at the trustee. So the definition of trust is the willingness of the trustor to be vulnerable to the trustee because the trustor expects that the trustee will perform some action important to the trustor. So the trustor is willing to be vulnerable. The trustor is willing to be exposed to the potential of harm. I'm not suggesting that they're willing to be harmed, but they recognize that there's some risk. And so, but they're expecting that trustee to do something that the trustor expects the trustee to do something that the trustor cares about. So we've talked about risk, we've talked about trust, we've talked about risk and trust, but you'll notice in their model that they have these trustworthiness factors, and that's where we're really going to spend the time. How is trust built? So Mayer, Davis, and Scoorman suggest that actually the trustor evaluates the trustee, and whether that's a person or an institution, the trustor evaluates the trustee and then evaluates the trustee on 3 trustworthiness factors. So the trustor, the trustor is looking at the ability, integrity, and benevolence of the trustee. That's why I have the little profile and the arrow. So, and I'll walk through each of these one at a time. And the trust, according to their theory, the trustor actually could also, not just a person's ability, integrity, and benevolence, but also could actually be evaluating an institution on its ability, integrity, and benevolence. So ability. Ability is defined as the trustee has skills or competence in a particular area. So the trustor is looking at the trustee, and the trustor, it's a particular area that's an important part of the definition. So what that suggests is, as I said earlier, the trustor is not saying, oh, I'm going to trust this person in all areas. But the trustor is saying, I'm going to look at the trustee, and based on whatever it is I care about at this moment, it could be, as I mentioned, going to a restaurant, it could be car repairs, it could be anything, whatever that is, do they have skills, do they have competence, expertise in that particular area that I'm interested in? Research shows that patients look at this in terms of their physicians, and they'll say, is my physician competent? Do they have abilities in a particular area that's important to me, and therefore I trust that physician? Integrity then. So integrity is defined as, the trustor has the perception that the trustee has the same set of values as the trustor. So what that implies is that the trustor has a set of values that's important to the trustor, and they're looking at the trustee, and this is, I'm not claiming that this is conscious, right? A lot of this just happens unconsciously. But the trustor has a set of values, they're looking at the trustee, and they're saying, does this trustee have the same set of values that I do? And so if we think about the simple act of greeting somebody else, in the United States, it's very common for us to just hold out our hand, shake somebody else's hand, and look somebody in the eye. But in other cultures, to look somebody directly in the eye would actually be offensive, right? That would not be a shared value. And so we recognize in situations that people have a set of values. We may know those, and sometimes we don't. But what they're doing is when they're making a decision to trust, they're actually looking at the trustee, and then they're saying, does this person have the same set of values as I do? And research shows that there's lots of different, we can think of values. One value is honesty. And so I want to clarify that this particular theory doesn't define integrity as honesty. Honesty is one value, but there are other values as well. And research actually, things like work routines, right? So, some, depending on the boss, some people, they want to see you right on time every day. Some bosses are like, hey, as long as you do the work, I don't care what time you come in, that type of thing. Certain customs that we have, songs or dances, those types of things. Humor, the type of humor that we use. Wisdom, is wisdom valued or not valued? Hospitality, how are people treated when they're welcomed? All of those types of things. We all have those types of values. We all have been brought up certain ways. That's important to us and so we will evaluate other people. We'll make decisions about whether or not we'll trust other people based on what we believe is important in terms of how to be greeted or how to extend hospitality. Time preference is one. This is also another cultural difference. So there's a term that's used called monochronic and polychronic, and we talk about cultures being monochronic. In other words, people like to do one thing at a time. That is me. And then we talk about polychronic cultures in which people are very comfortable doing several things at a time. But also part of that cultural distinction is how people like to gain knowledge. So in monochronic cultures, people tend to like to gain knowledge through language, through speaking or through words, through what I'm doing today, which is I've got my PowerPoint and I'm talking. But in other cultures, the context becomes very important. What was interesting to me one time was I had a student from another country in a different culture, definitely a polychronic culture. And context was very important. So the student felt offended when I walked through instructions and was very explicit. Now, my students in the United States are very used to that. So they want step one to do this, step two to do this. But in another culture, that actually can be seen as putting somebody down, right? Because they're getting that information from watching, from learning, from watching other people as well. So It's really important when we think about trust to be thinking about not just what our values are, but what are other people's values. And if we're looking at building trust, thinking about the values that they're bringing into a situation and then helping them to trust in us because we're recognizing we may not always agree with their values, but just recognizing their values. Now, the third trustworthiness factor is benevolence. So, benevolence is defined as the trustor believes that the trustee will do something for the trustor without expecting anything in return. So, it's this thought of the trustee will do something for the trustor, and it doesn't expect to be paid, doesn't expect something, a quid pro quo, does nothing. The trustor believes that that trustee is willing to do something without expecting anything in return for whatever it is that they've done. So one researcher talks about this in terms of suffering, that the trustee is really sincere about wanting to alleviate or relieve somebody else's suffering. We think of generosity, we think of patient forbearance, patient endurance. We think of humility, temporal depth. So what we mean by temporal depth is that we're thinking into the future. And the more somebody can think into the future, the further they can think into the future, the greater their temporal depth. And so when we think about benevolence, research suggests that sometimes a trustee, the person who is being trusted, actually does think, maybe doing something, not expecting anything in return, and maybe recognizes that whatever it is they've done for the trustor may not benefit them at that moment, but may benefit them at some point, in the future, in the long term. What was really interesting was some research that I did with some colleagues. We were looking at nurses, and we were looking at nurses at this particular healthcare system, looking at nurses also in terms of generation, but also in terms of which nurses tended to be assigned to a unit, and then which nurses moved around the hospital. I don't want to use the term travel nurses. We've seen that a lot in the news these past few years with COVID. So I don't mean to imply these nurses were going outside of the hospital. They were in the hospital, but some nurses are not always assigned to one unit. They just move around the hospital. And what was really interesting was how much benevolence really impacted turnover intentions, especially for younger nurses. So for nurses, first of all, if they rated their supervisors or their mentors higher on benevolence, in other words, they were saying, yeah, I believe that my manager, my supervisor is willing to do things for me and not expecting anything in return, then they were less likely to say, yeah, I'm thinking about looking for a job someplace else. But the other piece of it was also this aspect of if they were not assigned to a unit, if they were nurses that actually did float or move around the hospital and do different jobs on different days, but they still rated their mentor or their supervisor higher on benevolence, then they were more likely to say, yeah, I'm happy staying at my job. And I find that really interesting, in particular because when you don't have that immediate connection constantly with a boss, then it suggests that benevolence becomes even more important. So, trust. One of the things that is important to keep in mind in terms of ability, integrity, and benevolence is they're really on a continuum. So we don't necessarily expect every single person we trust to be high on ability, on integrity, and on benevolence. And, I think of my accountant. I expect my accountant to be high on ability. I expect that person to be competent, to know tax laws, to be able to do financial calculations accurately, those types of things. I expect my accountant to be high in integrity. I expect them to do the taxes, to adhere to the tax law. I do not want to get a visit from the IRS. But do I expect my tax accountant to do something for me without expecting anything in return? Do I expect that person to do my taxes and not get paid? No. So benevolence for me in that particular situation doesn't have to be high. I would say, yes, for that situation, I would want high on ability and integrity, but benevolence, I'm not so worried about it. What's really interesting is when I do this presentation with my classes and I'll ask them about an accountant, and they pretty much agree with me on that, high in ability, high in integrity, not so much benevolence. But then I'll say, tell me about a nurse. Do you want your nurse high in ability? Oh, definitely, right? We don't want an incompetent, yep, they want a competent nurse. Do you want your nurse high in ability? Yep. High in integrity, sharing the same values, caring for you. Yep. High in benevolence. Always they say yes, definitely high. Why the different expectations? Why do you want the nurse to be high on benevolence as well and less so a tax accountant? And what's really interesting in their response is the notion of vulnerability. They say, because I am more vulnerable in a situation where I am perhaps in the hospital and a nurse is caring for me than I am when I'm having my taxes done. And when we're in which suggests when we're in situations where we are more vulnerable, then having the trustee rated high on all three dimensions becomes more important. So how to build trust. So we've talked about risk, we've talked about trust, we've talked about trustworthiness factors, and now how do you build trust? So some research actually suggests that there are behaviors that can help to support perceptions of ability and integrity and benevolence. And so research on mentoring behaviors. So this looks at informational or more of the knowledge-based types of support, and then more psychosocial types of support has shown that it increases perceptions of ability, integrity, and benevolence. So coaching is that informational type of support where it's just teaching somebody how to do something. Exposure and visibility is introducing people. So, you know somebody and you say, hey, I'm going to introduce you to this person, so this will help you in this way. Challenging assignments. Again, this is more mentoring type behaviors and more of a workplace type of situation. But, saying to somebody, hey, I think you know this, and I'm going to just help you, if you learn, X, but if you learn Y as well, that's really going to be beneficial for you. So, here's a challenging assignment to help you get to that point. Sponsorship, which is actively saying, I'm going to nominate you for this. You've done a great job. I'm going to nominate you for this award or whatever it is. And then the more psychosocial types of mentoring types of behaviors. So protection, and I don't mean to imply, if somebody does something willfully wrong that they're protected, but, people make mistakes. I mean, it just happens. And so, if somebody makes a mistake and, protecting them from being unduly blamed. Role modeling, so demonstrating this is the type of work behavior or whatever that we'd like you to be able to do. Acceptance and confirmation, so saying to somebody, I know that you're feeling a little nervous right now, but I think, what you did here was good. Just giving them that support, friendship, those social opportunities, and then counseling, listening to people's personal concerns and helping them where we can. So these types of behaviors, even though they're called mentoring behaviors, we can use them in lots of different situations. And research has shown that the more knowledge-based, informational types of behaviors do help to build perceptions of ability when managers engage in these behaviors, and when managers are more supportive in providing that psychosocial support, then it builds perceptions of integrity and benevolence. And so thinking about, and it depends, friendship is a very interesting one because, and again, when I talk to my classes, there will be a little bit of a gender divide on friendship. Women tend to value friendship more. And so if we're talking about a situation where you may have a manager and the manager goes out to lunch with some of his or her employees, but not going out to lunch with other employees, then the women tend to be a little bit more like, well, I don't share that value. It seems like favorites are being played, we're playing favorites here. So I would rate that manager lower on integrity. Men don't seem to be bothered quite as much about that. So, we recognize that there are differences between people and between different groups of people, but these behaviors do help us think about ways in which we as managers, or just in our daily interactions, can be supportive of other people and help other people. But this is also a way of building trust. And when I talked about the definition of vulnerability, but when we think about vulnerability, and I'm just going to pop ahead here for a second. In the past, when I've talked about it just previously in my slides, that arrow was always going from the trustor to the trustee. But what if we flip it? What if we think about vulnerability differently? And Father James talks about an alternate approach to vulnerability. What if we think about opening up ourselves, being vulnerable ourselves? So letting ourselves be susceptible to potential harm. And what would that do in terms of building trusting types of relationships? So this alternative approach to vulnerability, again, going back to when I was talking about trust, we tend to think about it as a liability or an obstacle. We tend to think about risk. And originally I talked about risk and said, we tend to think about it in terms of distribution, right? I want to minimize risk for myself. Where can I shift that risk back to another person? So when we think about, but I suggested at the beginning, maybe it's better, instead of thinking about a distribution of risk, to think about it more in terms of how do we build trust so that we're minimizing risk for everybody. And so Father James actually suggests that, again, not taking that obstacle approach or that negative approach to it, but maybe thinking about it more in terms of allowing ourselves to be at risk in response to each other. So what I'm suggesting here is that to build, because oftentimes it's important for us to be considering how are people perceiving us as a trustee. And instead of worrying so much, and I don't want to minimize what I just talked about in terms of ability, integrity, and benevolence, but instead of worrying about how people are perceiving our ability, integrity, and benevolence, are we thinking about being a trustee, looking at our trustors and appreciating their ability, their integrity, their benevolence, finding something that they have and recognizing that and trusting them as the first step before we ask them to trust us. And actually, there's already been some research done on that. So again, in the business area, but trusting workers before you know enough to assess their trustworthiness actually enhances the manager's trustworthiness. But when the manager takes that initiative to trust first, it builds a stronger trusting relationship. So in trusting before someone has earned trust so that they can grow into it. So I want to thank you very much and open it up for questions. So the question was, so Drs. Mayer, Davis, and Skurman, who originally proposed this model of trust, did they also, I'm just going to backtrack a little bit here. So I think it might be easier to take a look at the picture. So did they propose that we should be entrusting the trustor, that we should think about ourselves as trustee? Not originally. So they actually had, their original model was trustor evaluating the trustee. And, but it's been subsequent research. Actually, and I'm just going to move forward here, Dr. Brower was one of their students. So that flowed out of their research. So that's a great comment, and I'm just going to repeat it back. So, you were talking about a parent and a child relationship, and the parent giving some sort of small chore or job to the child to help the child build confidence, recognizing the child may not, and correct me if I'm misinterpreting what you said, but recognizing the child may not be doing it properly 100% of the time, but it's that way of building a bond between the parent and the child and growing that trust. Yes. Definitely. Yep, that's definitely an example of what I'm talking about. Yeah, I think it's a great example. Yeah, yeah.
I saw your picture up there.
So I'm just going to recap a little bit of that. And so, so the comment was that looking at the institutional trust and looking at the building, the first thought was schools, and thinking of the building as representing, the school as an institution, and looking at the concerns about the acrimony, much of the disagreements between the school and the parents and the school and students and just all of those different parties that are involved. And can this theory shed some light on maybe helping to help calm things down a little bit or building trust in those particular environments? And you had mentioned, things can be different at, the junior high, elementary, junior high, high school than it can be at college. And it certainly can, because you know what? They're usually past that hormonal stage by the time they get to college. So, yeah, that's part of it. But I think too, so I'm thinking back to a middle school where I used to live, and the principal there actually lived literally almost next door to the school. And every night he would take his dog for a walk, and he would walk around the school. And so people got to know him. He'd walk in the neighborhood and he'd walk around the school, and they got to know him. But they also recognized that particular principal had he was really invested. He wasn't there because this was a job, right? He wasn't there because he was going to make a name for himself and then move on to another school. He was there because he really cared about that neighborhood, that group of students. And my sense was, and I lived in that neighborhood, so I didn't have any children who went to that particular school, but my sense was that those simple things that he did was demonstrating that he valued the community. Like, he valued the school enough that he would walk around it roughly about 8 o'clock every night to check and make sure that it was secure and safe and it wasn't harmed. But people knew he was watching it, right? And so, those types of things that he did, right? I care about the school, and he was a very calm type of person as well. And so I think that it does come down sometimes to, what are individuals doing? And how are they demonstrating that they really, like them? You might argue that the act of walking the dog every night was an act of benevolence. He wasn't getting paid, right, to check the school for, damage or vandalism, anything like that. That he was doing without expecting anything in return. But what happened was very little happened around that school too, because people knew that and they saw it. But when he was out walking his dog, he'd also say hi, and he'd ask you how you were doing, and those types of things. So he really worked on building a community. And my sense was that some of the disagreements about what should be taught in a school, or should these books be in the library, those I think he really tried to manage in more of a community. Let's talk, and reason this out with each other versus, having it kind of blow up, so to speak. And that's not an answer to a big problem, but it's, yeah, sure. And so again, just to recap, because this is being videotaped, so I'm assuming TV program was about a woman who was involved in a prison ministry, but she would actually go and be in a prison yard with gentlemen who were much bigger than her, but there she would be, and she made herself, first of all, physically vulnerable, but then also emotionally vulnerable because she shared her hurts, her failings, her struggles in life with them. And through that work that she was doing, was able to then minister to the folks there. And so that's a great example that you shared of that, being vulnerable, opening ourselves up, being vulnerable to the person who might be traditionally considered the trustor. And that also reminds me of an example. So I have a friend involved in a church, and what they do is they have a very active prison ministry, so that when folks are released from prison, they actually then, they provide, they'll help them get an apartment, and they provide beds and, linens and, those types of kitchen supplies. But then they also, as part of that, invite them to their church. Right? And so that's another act of vulnerability. And so they have, and what they will do for the folks who are just getting ready to be released from prison, if they're interested in working with this particular church, they will begin attending services there before they're released. So they begin building that community, and they have that community established when they're released. Yeah. Yeah, but it's a great example of making ourselves vulnerable to somebody else, and trusting them first before we ask them to trust us. Yeah, thank you. So the question was, does the theory address what happens if trust fails? So if for example, the trustor has trusted the trustee, and then there's the consequence of that trusting is negative in some way, or vice versa. Did I capture the question correctly? Okay, so do we have another hour? So yes, there is a lot of research on that. And the research talks about how hard it is to rebuild trust. But again, it depends, so it depends on how long the relationship has been in place, how much of a risk or how vulnerable were they. So for example, let's say I was handing out pieces of candy, and I said, I only have so much, so you each have to take 2. But somebody took 3 pieces of candy, and that left one person with only 1, right? And I trusted that everybody would, on their honor system, only take 2 pieces of candy. Is that big of a deal, right? I mean, is it going to crush, or am I going to lose all trust in the trustee? No, probably not. But you hear in the news about celebrities, and they have these managers or their parents, or somebody that they truly trusted, who stole literally millions and millions of dollars, hundreds of millions of dollars from them, right? And so have they have they totally lost trust in that person? Definitely. Can they rebuild trust? Yes. Is it super difficult? Definitely. And the theory would suggest that you would just start out by starting with ability, and then integrity, demonstrating that matching of values, and then build up to benevolence. But yes, when trust is broken, it's very difficult to build it back. It takes time. Not that it can't happen, but it is hard. Yeah. Other questions? And so just to recap very broadly, when somebody is willing to share something that happened to themselves, that can be very powerful in helping another person, right? To be able to say, yes, I went through this struggle, right? This incident where I, and it was hard for me, but here's how I was able to cope. Here's how I was able to overcome it. And when people are willing to be that vulnerable and say, yep, I made a mistake, or this happened to me. Maybe it wasn't a mistake, but it just happened to me. And, here's how I grew from it. Here's how I learned from it. When people are willing to be vulnerable and share those things, that can be very, very empowering for the other person to help. I think part of it is they just recognize they're not alone, right? It's not the first time this has happened. They're not by themselves. And this is my opinion, so I don't want to imply that it's coming from the audience, but my opinion is, especially after COVID-19, it's really important for everybody to just not feel alone. Like, I think we felt very lonely during the pandemic, and to recognize, we're not, and these things happen, sometimes things happen, sometimes they're bad, but we're not often the only person that happened to, and so, we can get support from other people when they're willing to be vulnerable with us. Yeah. Yeah. Anything else? Well, this has been delightful. So once again, I would like to thank all of the people at Allen County Public Library for all the work that they did, all the folks behind the scenes. I really appreciate them doing this videotape today. Thank you very much for coming tonight out in the rainy weather, and I hope you have the rest of the evening goes well for you. Thank you.
Production facilities provided by Access Fort Wayne. Learn more under the Explore tab at acpl.info.